They called her just a cleaner. But no one in that room understood how dangerous it was to be wrong about someone like her. The crystal chandelier above cast a warm golden glow over polished marble floors and $1,000 shoes. Laughter echoed across the penthouse as guests in tailored suits and silk dresses raised their glasses, careless and loud, until a single misstep shattered the illusion. Red wine spilled across Lena Brooks' hands, staining her dark skin like it belonged there. A man chuckled under his breath. Careful, that's what you're paid for, right? And just like that, the laughter spread, light at first, then sharper, cutting. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. She simply lowered her gaze and reached for a cloth, dropping to one knee beside the table as if the world above her had already decided her place, the fabric of her uniform brushing against the cold marble. Her hands steady despite the tremor that lived just beneath the surface. But the camera would have caught it, the faint hesitation, the way her fingers tightened for just a fraction of a second before moving again. And more importantly, it would have caught something else, something no one else in that room cared to notice. The thin white scars crossing her knuckles, old, precise, not the kind that came from cleaning floors or scrubbing dishes. They told a story, but no one there was listening. No one except one man, across the room, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glowing skyline of Manhattan. Alexander DeLuca paused mid-sip, the amber liquid in his glass catching the light as his gaze locked onto her hands. His expression didn't change, not at first, but something behind his eyes shifted, subtle, almost invisible, the kind of shift only someone who had seen too much in life would recognize. Conversations continued around him, deals whispered, alliances hinted at, but none of it seemed to reach him anymore. His focus had narrowed to a single point. Lena Brooks, still kneeling, still silent, still invisible to everyone else. A woman at the table leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs as she watched with mild amusement. Honestly, they'll hire anyone these days, she said, her voice dripping with casual cruelty. Another guest smirked, lifting his glass. As long as they know how to clean up their own mess. More laughter, louder this time, filling the room. But Lena didn't react, not outwardly. She finished wiping the spill, her movements controlled, deliberate, as if she had done this 1,000 times before, as if humiliation was just another task to complete before the night was over. Yet there was something in the way she stood back up, slow, composed, her eyes lifting just enough to scan the room for a brief second, not pleading, not angry, just aware. And that was when Alexander moved, setting his glass down with a quiet precision that somehow cut through the noise, his shoes barely making a sound against the marble as he stepped forward, each movement measured, intentional, and though no one realized it yet, the entire atmosphere of the room had already begun to change, because the one man who never paid attention to things that didn't matter had just decided that she did. The music did not stop, but it softened, as if even the room itself sensed a shift it could not explain. Conversations faltered at the edges, glances turning subtly toward Alexander DeLuca as he moved closer, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate, the kind of movement that carried authority without needing to announce it. Lena had already stepped back, her cleaning cloth folded neatly in her hand, ready to disappear again, into the background where people like her were expected to remain. But something in the air held her there for half a second longer than usual, just enough time for him to notice, really notice, not the uniform, not the role, but the way she carried herself, straight spine, controlled breath, eyes that did not dart around in fear, but measured the room with quiet awareness. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the faint lines across her knuckles more clearly now, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The guests watched with mild curiosity at first, assuming this was nothing more than a passing correction, perhaps a reminder of staff boundaries. The woman who had mocked her earlier tilted her head slightly, smiling as if expecting to be entertained. "Is there a problem?" she asked lightly, her tone still carrying that same effortless superiority. Alexander did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on Lena's hands. "Hold still," he said quietly, not a command shouted across the room, but something softer, more precise, and somehow that made it heavier. Lena hesitated, just barely, then allowed her hand to remain where it was. The room grew quieter now, not silent, but Close enough that the absence of laughter felt noticeable, Alexander reached out, not touching, just observing, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if confirming something he had not expected to find. "Those are not from cleaning," he said, more to himself than to her. A man at the table let out a short laugh, trying to break the tension. "What does it matter? She is staff. She cleans, that is all." A few nods followed, eager to return to the comfort of their assumptions. But Alexander finally shifted his gaze, slow, deliberate, landing on the man who had spoken, and for the first time that night, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, not physically, but in the way people adjusted their posture, the way smiles faded just a little too quickly. "That is all," Alexander repeated, his voice calm, almost curious, but there was something underneath it that made the words feel heavier than they should have been. The man cleared his throat, suddenly less certain. "I mean, that is what she is here for," he replied, weaker now. Lena said nothing, her eyes lowered again, but not in submission, more like patience, as if she had seen this moment play out before in a different room, with different people, and knew exactly how it ended. Alexander straightened, his expression unreadable, yet his attention had not left her for a single second, and somewhere deep beneath the polished surface of that luxurious penthouse, something unseen had already begun to unravel. Because in a room full of people who believed they understood power, only one man had realized that the quietest person there might be the one who had nothing left to prove. The silence did not arrive all at once. It crept in, slowly, like a draft through an open window, subtle but impossible to ignore. One by one conversations faded, glasses lowered, eyes shifted, because Alexander DeLuca was no longer just observing. He was choosing, and in a room like this, that meant something. Lena remained still, her hands now clean, the cloth folded with care, as if the act itself mattered more than the humiliation that came with it. She could feel the weight of attention pressing against her, but she did not react to it. Not the way they expected. No nervous apology, no attempt to justify her presence. Just quiet, controlled breathing, as if she had learned long ago that dignity did not require permission. A man near the center table leaned forward, attempting to reclaim the atmosphere with a forced chuckle. "With all due respect, this seems unnecessary. We are here to discuss business, not staff details." His tone was polite, but there was irritation beneath it, the kind that came from someone used to being in control of conversations. Alexander turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. "Business," he repeated, as if tasting the word. Then his gaze returned to Lena. "You think this has nothing to do with business?" The man hesitated, caught off guard. "I think we are wasting time," he replied, firmer now, trying to regain footing. A few others nodded subtly, eager to move past the discomfort. But Alexander took another step forward, closing the distance just enough that Lena could feel his presence without him needing to raise his voice. "Tell me something," he said calmly. "How long have you been working here?" The question was directed at her now. Clear, unmistakable. Lena lifted her eyes just enough to meet his, not fully, but enough to answer. 6 months, sir." Her voice was steady, soft but not weak. The room seemed to hold its breath, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Without hesitation, without fear, Alexander nodded once, as if confirming a detail in his mind. 6 months, he repeated, then glanced briefly around the room, taking in the faces that had dismissed her moments ago. "And in 6 months, none of you have noticed anything unusual?" Confusion flickered across several expressions. The woman who had mocked her earlier frowned slightly. "Unusual? She cleans, she keeps quiet. That is exactly what she is supposed to do," she said, her confidence returning in the safety of numbers. But Alexander's expression did not change. If anything, it grew more focused. "Exactly," he said, almost under his breath, as if that was the problem. Lena's fingers tightened slightly around the cloth, the smallest movement, but enough for him to see. Enough to confirm what he had already begun to suspect. There was a history here, one that did not belong in a place like this, one that had been hidden in plain sight. And for the first time that night, the balance of the room shifted completely, because what had started as casual cruelty was no longer just about a cleaner. It had become a question, And Alexander DeLuca was not a man who asked questions without already knowing that the answer would change everything. No one answered him. Not immediately. Because the question itself felt misplaced in a room built on certainty. People here were used to knowing exactly who everyone was, what they were worth, and where they stood. That was the unspoken structure that kept everything comfortable, predictable, controlled. But Alexander had just cracked that structure with a single sentence. And now doubt lingered where confidence had been seconds before. Lena remained where she stood, neither stepping forward nor retreating, her presence quiet, but no longer invisible, as if the moment itself had pulled her out of the background whether she wanted it or not. The man who had spoken earlier shifted in his seat, clearing his throat as he tried to recover. If there is something to say, then say it. He pressed, though the edge in his voice betrayed a growing unease. Alexander did not respond right away. Instead, he turned slightly, his attention returning to Lena with that same precise focus. "Look at me," he said, not harsh, not demanding, but firm enough that it carried weight. For a brief second, she hesitated, not out of fear, but calculation. Then slowly, she lifted her gaze fully for the first time, and something changed in the room the instant she did, because her eyes did not match the role they had assigned to her. There was no submission there, no quiet desperation, only clarity, the kind that came from someone who had already faced situations far more difficult than this one. Alexander held her gaze, studying, confirming, and then he exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if a question he had been carrying for a long time had just been answered. "I thought so," he murmured, just loud enough to be heard in the stillness. Confusion rippled through the guests. The woman who had mocked her earlier frowned deeper now, her earlier confidence beginning to crack. "Thought what?" she demanded, her voice sharper, less controlled. But Alexander did not turn toward her, not yet. Instead, he spoke again, still looking at Lena. 6 months, he repeated, and not once did you correct them. Lena's expression did not change, but her voice came, steady and calm. It was not necessary. The simplicity of the answer landed heavier than anyone expected. A few guests exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Alexander gave a faint nod, as if that answer confirmed more than it revealed. Then finally, he turned, facing the room fully now, his presence expanding in a way that made the space feel smaller, tighter. "You see what you expect to see," he said evenly, his voice carrying without effort. "You hear what fits your assumptions, and you ignore everything else." No one interrupted him. No one dared to, because something in his tone had shifted from curiosity to certainty. The man at the table tried once more, forcing a thin smile. "With all due respect, you are making this far more complicated than it needs to be." But this time, Alexander did look at him, directly, and whatever the man saw there made his smile falter before it could fully form. "No," Alexander replied quietly. "It has been complicated the entire time." The words settled over the room like a weight, and for the first time that night, the possibility began to take shape in their minds, small at first, then growing, that the woman they had dismissed so easily might not be what they thought at all. And that realization, more than anything else, was what made the silence that followed feel so absolute. The silence stretched longer this time, not empty but heavy, filled with thoughts no one wanted to say out loud. Because once a doubt takes root, it does not stay small. It grows, it spreads, and suddenly the room that once felt controlled begins to feel uncertain. Lena stood exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her breathing even. But now every eye in the room rested on her in a way it had not before, not dismissive anymore, not amused, but searching, as if they were trying to rewrite everything they thought they knew about her in real time. Alexander let the silence settle. He did not rush to fill it, because he understood something the others did not. That silence, when used correctly, could reveal more than any explanation ever could. Finally, he stepped back slightly, creating space, not distance, but perspective. His voice came again, calm, measured. "Tell me," he said, not to the room, but to Lena, "why here?" The question seemed simple, but it carried weight beneath it, layers that only someone like her would understand. A few guests exchanged confused glances, unsure what he meant. But Lena did not ask for clarification. She understood the question exactly as it was intended. Her eyes lowered briefly, not in submission, but in thought, as if choosing her words carefully. "Because no one looks twice at someone like me," she answered, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry through the stillness. The honesty in her tone made several people shift uncomfortably, because it was true, and they all knew it. Alexander nodded slowly, almost as if he had expected that answer. "And that was useful," he added, not as a question, but as a continuation. Lena met his gaze again, just for a moment. "Yes," she said simply. A faint tension moved through the room. Subtle but undeniable, the kind that comes when a conversation begins to move beyond what is safe. The woman who had mocked her earlier let out a small, incredulous laugh, though it sounded forced now. "Useful for what exactly?" she asked, her tone sharp, but lacking the confidence it once had. Alexander did not look at her. His attention remained where it had been from the moment he stepped forward. "That is the part you missed," he said quietly. Then finally, he turned, letting his gaze sweep across the room. Not hurried, not aggressive, just thorough, as if weighing each person against a standard they did not even realize they were being measured by. "All of you saw a role," he continued. "A uniform, a job title, something easy to define so you would not have to question it." No one interrupted, because now there was nothing casual left about the moment. No laughter, no whispered side comments, just attention, focused and absolute. "But she saw all of you," he added, his voice lowering slightly, not softer, but more precise. "Every conversation, every detail, every assumption you made when you thought no one important was listening." A flicker of unease passed through several faces, quick but visible. Because the implication was clear, Lena had not just been present, she had been aware, and awareness in the wrong hands could be uncomfortable, even dangerous. The man at the table leaned forward again, this time without the earlier confidence. "Are you suggesting that she—" he started, but stopped before finishing the sentence, because even he was not sure how to frame what was unfolding. Alexander tilted his head slightly, watching him struggle, then gave a faint, almost unreadable smile. "I am not suggesting anything," he said calmly. "I am telling you that the only difference between power and invisibility is whether someone chooses to look closely." The words landed quietly, but they carried further than any raised voice could have. And in that moment, something shifted completely, not in Lena, not in Alexander, but in the room itself, because the people who had laughed minutes ago were no longer certain they understood what they were standing in front of. And that uncertainty was something none of them were used to feeling. No one moved, not even the servers at the edges of the room, because something invisible had taken hold of the space, something heavier than authority, heavier than reputation. It was realization, slow and uncomfortable, the kind that forces people to look at themselves whether they want to or not. Lena could feel it now, the shift in how they saw her, the way their eyes lingered a second longer, searching for details they had ignored before, trying to piece together a version of her that made sense again. But there was no urgency in her, no need to correct them. She simply stood, composed, as if this moment did not belong to her but to them. Alexander watched it all unfold with quiet precision. He did not rush to explain, because he knew explanation would only make it easier for them. And nothing about this should be easy. The man who had spoken earlier leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the table, a subtle sign of discomfort he could not fully hide. "If she has been watching," he said carefully, choosing his words now, "then that raises concerns." His tone had shifted from dismissive to cautious, and that alone said enough. Alexander tilted his head slightly, considering him. "Concerns," he repeated, not mocking, just acknowledging the word as if it were something worth examining. Then he glanced back at Lena. "Did you come here to cause concern?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more personal. Lena shook her head once, a small, controlled movement. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I came here to work." The answer was simple, almost disarming in its honesty. But that was what made it land so deeply, because it removed the threat they were trying to assign to her. It left them with something far more uncomfortable, the possibility that they had created this tension themselves. The woman who had mocked her earlier shifted in her seat, her posture less relaxed now, her earlier confidence replaced by something tighter, more guarded. "Then what is all this about?" she asked, her voice no longer smooth. Alexander finally turned to face her fully, his expression calm, but his eyes sharper now. "This," he said, gesturing lightly between Lena and the room, "is about perception." The word hung there, simple but loaded. You decided what she was the moment you saw her, and from that point on, you stopped paying attention. He continued, his tone even, but each word placed with intention. You stopped listening, you stopped observing, you stopped questioning, and that is where you made your mistake. No one interrupted him now, because there was nothing left to interrupt with. The room had shifted too far for that. The man at the table glanced briefly at Lena again, then back at Alexander, as if weighing something internally. "And what exactly did we miss?" he asked, quieter now, not challenging, but genuinely uncertain. Alexander did not answer immediately. He let the question settle, let it sit in the silence where it could not be avoided. Then slowly, he looked back at Lena, his gaze steady, almost respectful now. "That depends," he said softly, "on whether she decides to tell you." The weight of that sentence changed everything, because it placed control somewhere no one in that room expected, not in wealth, not in status, but in the quiet presence of someone they had dismissed without a second thought. Lena did not speak right away. She did not rush to fill the silence. And in that pause, something became unmistakably clear. This was no longer about what Alexander knew. It was about what she chose to reveal. And for the first time that night, every person in that room understood that they were no longer the ones in control of the narrative no one expected her to speak. Not after everything that had just shifted, because silence had already done more than words ever could. But the moment stretched just long enough that it demanded something, not from Alexander, not from the room, but from Lena herself. She felt it, the weight of every gaze, every assumption unraveling in real time. And still, she did not rush. She let the quiet settle fully before she moved. Her fingers relaxed around the cloth, her shoulders steady, and when she finally spoke, her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You did not miss anything," she said calmly, the words landing softer than expected, and yet somehow heavier. Confusion flickered again across several faces. The man at the table frowned slightly. "That does not make sense," he replied, his voice uncertain now, searching for something solid to hold on to. Lena's eyes shifted briefly toward him, not confrontational, just direct. "You saw exactly what you wanted to see," she continued, her tone even. "And that is enough for most people." The honesty in her words created a different kind of discomfort, one that did not come from fear, but from recognition. The woman who had mocked her earlier straightened in her chair, her posture more rigid now. "So you are saying this is our fault?" she asked, a trace of defensiveness returning, but weaker than before. Lena did not respond to the accusation directly. Instead, she took a small step forward, not into the center of the room, but just enough to shift her position from the edge of it. A subtle movement, yet it changed everything, because now she was no longer part of the background. She was part of the moment. "I am saying," she replied, choosing her words with care, "that you never needed to look deeper, so you did not." Her gaze moved briefly across the room, not lingering on any one person, but acknowledging all of them at once, and that made my job easier. That sentence landed differently, sharper, more precise, a quiet confirmation of everything Alexander had implied without saying it outright. A ripple of unease passed through the guests again, not loud, not visible to an outsider, but unmistakable to those within it, because now the idea was no longer abstract. It was real. The man at the table leaned forward slightly, his earlier confidence replaced with something more cautious. "What job?" he asked, the question coming out slower this time, more deliberate. Lena met his gaze again, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something beneath her calm exterior. Not anger, not fear, but clarity. "The one you never noticed," she said simply. And then she let the silence return, not forced, not dramatic, just present. Alexander watched her closely, not surprised, not confused, but certain, as if every word she spoke aligned with something he had already understood. He did not interrupt, did not explain, because this moment did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to her, and the room felt it. The shift of control, subtle but absolute. The woman who had laughed earlier looked down. Briefly, her expression tightening as if trying to reconcile the version of Lena she had created in her mind with the one standing in front of her now, and failing, because they did not match, they never had, and that realization, quiet and undeniable, settled into the room with a weight no one could ignore, because for the first time that night, they were not looking at a cleaner, they were looking at someone they did not understand, and that uncertainty was something far more powerful than anything they had been comfortable with before. The room did not recover from her words. It could not, because they were not dramatic enough to dismiss and not vague enough to ignore. They sat in the air with a quiet certainty that forced everyone to rethink what had just happened. Lena did not move again after speaking. She did not fill the silence or soften the impact. She simply stood there, composed, as if the truth required no decoration. Alexander watched the shift ripple through the room. The subtle tightening of shoulders, the hesitation in breathing, the way people avoided looking directly at her now, not out of disrespect, but because looking too closely meant admitting they had been wrong. And in a room built on control, that was not something they handled well. The man at the table leaned back slowly, his fingers no longer tapping, his earlier impatience replaced by something more careful. "If that is true," he said, choosing each word deliberately, "then you have been listening to conversations that were not meant for you." His tone was not accusing anymore. It was measured, cautious, as if he was trying to understand the boundaries of something he had not anticipated. Lena turned her gaze toward him again, calm, steady. "No," she said simply. "You chose where to speak, not me." The answer landed with a quiet precision that left no room for argument, because it placed responsibility exactly where it belonged. The woman who had mocked her earlier shifted. Again, her confidence now fully gone, replaced by discomfort she could not hide. "This is ridiculous," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We are acting like she is something more than she is." But even as she said it, her eyes flickered toward Lena, searching, uncertain. Alexander stepped forward then, not abruptly, but with purpose, his presence drawing the focus back to him for just a moment. "That is exactly the point," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You decided what she was before you ever gave her the chance to be anything else." He let that settle, then added, "And now you are uncomfortable because that decision was wrong." No one challenged him, not this time, because the evidence was standing right in front of them, undeniable. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the walls themselves had moved closer, the weight of realization pressing in from every side. Alexander glanced back at Lena, his expression no longer questioning, but acknowledging, a silent recognition of something deeper than status or role. "You asked what you missed," he continued, turning slightly toward the group again. "You missed the only person in this room who was not pretending." That sentence landed differently, heavier, more final, because it shifted the focus completely. It was no longer about what Lena was, it was about what they were not. The man at the table exhaled slowly, his posture changing, less rigid now, more reflective, as if he was beginning to understand the full weight of what had just unfolded. Lena did not react to Alexander's words, not outwardly, but there was a subtle shift in her stance, a quiet release of tension that had been held for longer than anyone there could imagine. She was no longer being measured, no longer being questioned. She simply was, and that alone was enough to change everything. Because in a room where power had always been defined by who spoke the loudest, it had just been redefined by someone who barely spoke at all, and no one in that room could deny it anymore. No one spoke after that, not because they had nothing to say, but because for the first time that night, they understood that speaking would only make things worse. The kind of silence that settled over the room was not empty. It was full of realization, of quiet regret, of something deeper that no one wanted to name. Lena stood where she was, no longer at the edge of the room, no longer invisible, but she did not take advantage of it, did not step forward into the space she had just been given. She simply existed within it, steady, composed, unchanged, as if the shift around her had nothing to do with who she was, but everything to do with who they had been. Alexander watched her for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as approval, not as permission, but as recognition. the kind that did not need words. He turned away from her then, not dismissing, but concluding, as if the point had already been made. "We are done here," he said calmly, his voice cutting cleanly through the silence. No one argued, no one questioned, because whatever business had brought them together suddenly felt less important than what had just unfolded. Chairs shifted quietly, glasses were set down, people stood, but their movements lacked the confidence they had walked in with. There were no more jokes, no more careless remarks, only subdued expressions and lowered voices. The woman who had laughed earlier hesitated for a moment before stepping away, her eyes flickering toward Lena one last time, not with mockery, but something closer to uncertainty, even discomfort, and then she turned and left without a word. One by one, the room emptied, the sound of expensive shoes against marble softer now, less certain, until the space that had been filled with noise and judgment was left with nothing but quiet. Lena exhaled slowly, a breath she had been holding longer than she realized, her fingers loosening slightly around the cloth in her hand. Alexander remained by the window, looking out over the city lights, his reflection faint in the glass. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be said. The shift had already happened. The lesson had already been delivered. Finally, Lena moved, not toward him, but toward the small cart she had left behind, placing the cloth back where it belonged with the same care she had shown all night, the same attention to detail, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Alexander's voice came again, quieter now, almost thoughtful. "You could have corrected them," he said, not turning. Lena paused for a brief second, then replied simply, "They would not have listened." Alexander let out a soft breath, something between agreement and understanding. "No," he said, "they would not have." Another silence followed, lighter this time, not heavy, not tense, just still. And then Lena continued her work, not as someone diminished, not as someone elevated, but as someone who had never needed either. And as the city lights flickered beyond the glass, reflecting a world that never stopped judging what it did not understand, the room behind her held on to one quiet truth that no one there would forget, that dignity does not ask to be seen. It simply waits for the moment when the world is finally forced to look, and that night, they did.